I just see people both talking about Sync more on social media. I see a lot of predictions that this is the key technology for the next years or more. And I suspect this is a one-day conference, right? It's a kind of maximum 300 people. And my hope and what I kind of think is that we'll look back on it in 10 years' time and see this as just one of the seminal conferences that actually the group of people who were there all then went on to do amazing things. And you kind of look back and it was a privilege to be there.
Welcome to Local First FM. I'm your host, Johannes Schickling, and this is a special episode of the podcast. We're together with Adam Wiggins and James Arthur. We're excited to announce the first Sync conference in San Francisco in November. I hope to see you at the conference. Also, a big thank you to Jazz for supporting this podcast. Hey, welcome back, James, Adam. It's so nice to have you back on the podcast. How are you doing?
Great to be here. Feeling good. We got something to be excited about.
Yeah, very well, thanks.
Awesome. Well, like Adam already mentioned, we have quite the exciting announcement. The announcement was already made a couple of weeks ago. And in fact, the very first time we talked about it publicly was at Local First Conf, where we announced that there would be a partner conference or sibling conference, however you want to call it, called Sync Conf, which doesn't happen in Berlin, but happens in San Francisco. And it felt appropriate to bring on the co-hosts of the event, James, Adam. Some of them are not here, such as Emma, Johanna, and Jans. But with you here, I think it would be interesting to talk through what the event is about, talking through the vision of the event, where it's kind of similar to Local First Conf, but also where it's different for Local First Conf. So I think, James, you brought up this idea initially that you just saw so much demand and so much pull and interest in sync engines, which is what Electric Sync is all about as well, that you, I think, raised the question, would it make sense to have a separate conference in partnership that is all about sync engines? So maybe you want to give your vision for the event and what's kind of made you suggest it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think a lot of us in this space were seeing this concept of sync emerge as in a way, sort of core technical aspect of local first that a lot of people who are looking to build local first were interested in to deliver some of the maybe sort of harder benefits around instant modern user experience and being a good architecture to build modern software on. Whereas local first is this sort of broader concept, which includes really interesting, motivating aspects of things like data privacy, which are not necessarily kind of on the kind of critical path if you're sort of building out a startup kind of in a hurry. And so sort of focusing on sync is a slightly more pragmatic take on some of the local first ideas. I think why it's so interesting at the moment is if you just sort of lean back, it's just such an interesting time to be alive as a software developer. So much of the software stack is just being reinvented and rethought as we speak. And so you have all of this previous generation software, which is sort of team-based SaaS enterprise software, and it's all essentially being rewritten as agentic software. And so there's this sort of huge move to where, in a way, all software is becoming agentic software, or certainly it's going to be like a large part of that software future. And just one of the key aspects of agentic software is if you start off with, say, users of your software, one of the main drivers for local first or real-time sync architectures in the first place is multi-user. So you introduce multiple users, and if they're both doing things on the same data, you have to have some kind of sync architecture to keep them in sync. But with agentic software, the moment you introduce agents as well as users, all software inherently becomes multi-user. And so agentic software is naturally collaborative. And if you just sort of step back and think, well, how am I going to build these systems? If you try to build those on manual data wiring, it's just crazy, and you're going to have bugs and stale data and a whole load of extra boilerplate. And so this sort of core technology of sync or sync engine architecture, which in a way has emerged initially as like a component of real-time or local first systems, is now just the key architecture for building agentic systems. And it's very hard to imagine how you could build agentic systems without it. And as all software moves to agentic, it then really becomes the key architecture for building this next generation of modern software.
Right. That is very interesting, since when we first started talking about like doing this extra conference, that hasn't even been yet at the center of it. Since like in many months ago, agentic systems, agentic coding has been sort of like on the horizon, but it hasn't been really there yet as prominently as it is today. So like the topic and the core focus of SyncConf is now even more relevant. It is not exclusively about agentic systems, but I think they make it just even more clear that we need a better answer for like data management, particularly in a multi-user or multi-agent way. Like if you think about users as a user agent, now we have just different ones. And that is like multiplayer collaborative software has always been the foundation or one of the core pillars of local first. But like you say, if you put that front and center as the most important one, then that's the more pragmatic way of getting there. So Adam, you as one of the co-authors of the local first essay, how do you feel about kind of tearing apart those different ideals of local first software and now focusing on one in particular with SyncConf?
Yeah, well, certainly I'll echo what James said, that it's kind of a pragmatism and idealism, not necessarily against each other, but rather maybe the proportion in the mix. Local first conf, I think, is very, and local first in general, is very driven by those ideals of user agency, data ownership, and that sort of thing. And what we see is just a better way for computers to serve human needs in the long run. But then something really interesting started to happen at the conferences both years, but especially this last year, when we really saw a lot of people coming to the community a lot more interested in those pragmatic benefits, or maybe more compelled by them. And to me, that's, there's a version where, I don't know, I could feel, or people who came from that more ideological background, which obviously I do, could feel like, wait a minute, we're here with these grand ideals, and you just show up and say, hey, we want fast UIs and cheaper hosting bills, and hey, this works really well with agentic AI. And we say, wait a minute, you're missing out on those grand ideals. But I actually see it as a big tent thing, that it's actually pretty interesting and actually pretty awesome that people came to this technology or this kind of architecture from many different reasons, but we can kind of get all of these we get a lot of different benefits, and people have different reasons to prefer. I'm here for the pragmatic benefit of just the simplified stack and the developer experience, and other people are more about the user agency and data ownership. But we all come together, and I think that that coalition is stronger, and it's an opportunity to expand the reach and to make this way of building software that we've all fallen in love with something that can spread even further.
That makes sense. So in a way, local first has, for me, always been about sort of like aspiring to a greater way of building things to ultimately serve a human, give them more agency, etc. And it has been a huge source of inspiration for myself. And I think this is why we did the local first conf as well, to broaden that even further, to give voices to many different people working on interesting things, etc. And for me, like the core of it has always been inspiring makers building software that we can do better. And sync engines and data syncing in general, I think, is part of that. But I think it's the biggest bang for the buck, basically. Like this is where you can use off-the-shelf technologies today, and you get the furthest with that technology. Like there's to really get there fully with local first, I think very few apps at all like do that full justice to all 7 ideals. Like if you basically look at it through the eyes of Martin Kleppmann, where like he defines of like, is it local first software? Yes, no. I think very few pieces of software like fully are local first, but I think that's fine. And SyncConf is like very much like an encouragement of that fact and of that trade-off. Like I continue to be inspired by the local first ideals, but I think it makes a lot of sense for folks to like embrace sync engines like Electric, like Jazz, like Zero, etc., to build better apps faster and not having the ideals stand in the way of shipping.
I think that's it, right. And I think as there's also a kind of game afoot at the moment where working out the best stack for software, because so one of the big trends that's happening to software at the moment is agentic. And so the type of software that we're building is changing. But at the same time, how we're building the software is changing because you have these AI code editors and LLMs. And so the sort of first generation of those has chosen stacks like, for example, Supabase, which is awesome. And you can kind of go a long way there with like a backend as a service framework and a database built in and sensible APIs. But if you have LLMs generating code with data fetching in it, then that application that it's writing can quickly turn into spaghetti. And I know from speaking to a number of them that a lot of these leading AI code editor platforms and LLM platforms are just looking ahead to go, well, what actually is the best stack for the software that we're generating? And I think as well, that's where you come back to distinctions between, say, imperative data fetching and declarative data fetching. And a sync engine is just like the core technology to unlock your ability to move to a declarative model that allows you to move these elements of data transfer out of the LLM generated code domain, which means that the applications that the LLMs generate are much better, but they're also much more maintainable and more likely to be able to move into production and evolve.
That makes perfect sense. And so this brings me to my next question. Who would be the target audience for the conference? So if you're now listening as a typical Local First FM listeners, maybe you're here for the thinking big pie in the sky inspiration, and you're dreaming of a world where like all software is purely local first, but maybe you're also here as a React developer who is currently using something like 10-stack query and just like gets by shipping stuff quickly. And you're just looking for like a bigger lever to ship stuff even more quickly and giving people a better user experience. So my take would be the latter one is exactly the right target audience. Someone who ships code, like not how it looks like in 3 years from now, but today, and they need to pick something that doesn't make their life harder, but easier, with ideally no strings attached.
Yeah, I think that's what I've been telling folks in the Switch community and the Local First community, and the sorts of folks that come to Local First Conf. In a way, you probably know a lot of this already. So I see it as the people who are maybe more Local First curious. They've been interested in this. They've seen the energy in the space. They hear about these, they use Linear and they're, how is it so fast? And then they see it, Linear CTO giving the talk at Local First Conf, basically saying it's because we use a sync engine. And they go, okay, well, I'm interested in that, but how do I get started? Where do I get started? So what I've basically been looking for is the opportunity to invite people who are on that edge there. They maybe are a more, what would you call it, mainstream developer, or just someone who's, focused on building software with proven technology, which is absolutely a very sensible way to work your career. But then, you want to be aware of things that can, yes, help you build better software, help you build that software faster. And as you pointed out, there are parts of the Local First stack, if you want to call it that are kind of ready for production today. There's other parts that are still more researchy, more speculative and aspirational. And so I think that's part of what this conference is doing, is focusing on those parts that are like, hey, you can really use this today. And the evidence is a lot of the speakers we have from places like Figma and Notion and OpenAI. In fact, Notion just launched their offline support based on a lot of this pioneering work by the Local First community. And we're saying, hey, this big company has done it for their at-scale product. One of their engineers who worked on it is going to come and tell you about it. And this is something you can practically use. It's less about the aspiration and more about, here's something you can go back to your job or your side projects and start using right now today.
Right. And I think another way to look at this as well is like the bar is constantly rising, right? Like in the baseline expectation of a consumer using an app, like that bar is constantly going up. Like similar to how back in the days, it would have been fine to have like a mostly static website. When you click, you see sort of like the forwarding in 3, 2, 1. And at some point just needed to be dynamic. It needed to be fast. And there was mobile. Every app needed to have a mobile app as well. And I think now the baseline expectations are changing, that Linear has sort of like normalized high quality expectations. So does Figma, so does Notion, etc. So the next generation of apps now have to, like the entry barrier is now already that high quality expectation. And I think the only way how we can get there, at least that I'm aware of, is to use sync engine technologies. And I think that's another way for people to look at why they should care about this conference, is like, if they want to build applications that have a competitive, rational chance of being adopted, then I think this can be a critical component to just like make faster apps that work collaboratively. Since if you don't use that and you try to build collaborative apps, good luck.
I think one thing is why we wanted to host it in San Francisco is that a lot of this new stack for agentic systems is still being figured out, and it's kind of being figured out on the ground by the people who are building that software, because you have to almost just dive in to kind of figure out what the actual problems are. What do you need to do to make these things work? So for SyncConf, moving from Berlin to San Francisco is partly because that's where the people building this next generation of agentic software are. And then for the people that we wanted to come to the conference was almost deliberately to combine product builders and some of the kind of leading product builders or people defining those stacks like Tanner from Tanstack, for example, with developers actually building kind of new software and agentic system on the ground. And I think if we can sort of have that cross-pollination from this sort of world of kind of sync engine, local first technologists and developer tooling with practical experience of building agentic systems, then it may be that actually it's not necessarily come to the conference to sort of find out how it's all done. It's like come to the conference and let's figure it out together.
That's a great point. One of the things I've loved so much about Local First Conf these last 2 years is it really feels like being part of a community that is in the process of figuring itself out, both what it stands for, but also what the technology is going to be and what the hard parts of the problem are and how to, monetize it or make a living out of it, how it relates to the current software that exists today, whether it sits side by side or it's more revolutionary or more incremental. All of that feels like it's happening very live, and we're hopefully creating a venue where that can happen. The three of us here, as well as our other co-organizers, have our own opinions about that and maybe their own directions we'd like to see things going. But it's a community and it's evolving in an organic way that's wandering in all kinds of interesting directions and exploring interesting nooks and crannies. And I see this as another chance, again, in a different place with a slightly different demographic of speakers, but probably also attendees. And it's which is sort of exploring another canyon in the idea maze, another path down that I think will give kind of fresh perspective. And it's hardly about here's how you do it. It's more like, let's figure out how to do it.
Right. And I think people are in different parts of the spectrum of like how much they have figured this out. I think we have like some real pioneers here. We have someone from Figma coming. When Figma launched, I think it launched out of the gate being collaborative. Like this is similar to how it blew me away when Google Docs launched and I saw like that blinking cursor and I could share it with a friend and like we could collaboratively, like that magic. I just recall it so strongly, and that was maybe even stronger for Figma. Like it blew me away how nice the software was. But then I could like share it with someone and saw their cursor. Figma has had that for now like many, many years, maybe even a decade. And so Figma has certainly figured out a lot of pieces there. And I think they have a much richer vocabulary around that already. And they've like blogged a lot about this with their live graph system. And so I think they have some really, really interesting stories to share there. So I'm really looking forward to that talk in particular. But we also hear from like many other speakers how they're already using some of those technologies in their applications and their stacks. So I'm curious whether there's any kind of particular talks that you're already looking forward to and what you're particularly looking for.
Yeah, well, I think we mentioned Figma and Notion already. They're both such notable examples of high craft software, but also at scale, at successful scale. In our industry. And so hearing from software engineers who have been working for a long time very directly on their CRDT based or sync engine based systems is going to be fantastic. I'm also looking forward to hearing from Sunil Pai, who's at Cloudflare now, but he's previously was creator of PartyKit. And I think of him as both a local first OG, but also someone who's very forward thinking. And I think he is going to speak on the building agentic apps topic. And, he's better qualified than almost anyone I know to talk about that thing that we kind of touched on earlier, which is, okay, here's how users are expecting software to work now. And it turns out that the Sync engine foundation that we have created already is actually a really, in addition to all these other benefits it has, like the multiplayer collaboration by default or the better developer experience, also actually is the best foundation for doing this kind of software.
I think for me, the one I'm most looking forward to is Frank McSherry from Materialized. So personally, right back in the beginning, before starting Electric, when I was first digging into this space, discovering some of his work on differential data flow, timely data flow, building that into Materialize as like a streaming database product was one of the big inspirations behind starting what we're doing with Electric. And so he's personally invented and then pioneered and evolved a lot of the core underlying tech but behind Sync technology. But also, I think with the journey with Materialize, which is now quite a mature company serving larger customers, they have evolved from being a streaming analytics database to a platform where you can also build applications on top of that streaming data. And so I think his insights both into the development of the technology, but also the use cases and the demand that's sort of pulling them towards that application development use case is really telling, because rather than just being like doubling down on an analytics use case, they're seeing that their customers want them to build applications on this pattern. And so I think understanding about that would be really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I remember looking into Materialize many years ago, and I've been like blown away by like the similar premise basically, which is to think about data more declaratively and less imperatively, so that you can basically from your data sources have like an always up-to-date view, which is kind of like what sync engines are about as well. Like, yes, Materialize started out earlier more in the analytical space, but now it's kind of like a blurry line where like your analytical workload and your like experiments stop and where your application starts, particularly now where you kind of have not just the high quality expectation for software in terms of craft and like being collaborative, but also for like how smart your software should be. Right. I think the days are over where the expectation can stop by software being like fully deterministic and like just the hard coded functions. But now you kind of like you've used ChatGPT. So like, why not? Why shouldn't your other tool like be able to operate in that way and fulfill your hopes and wishes in this way? And so a lot of what makes that happen is data. And I think this is like also the main theme of the conference is like, okay, to build awesome apps, we got to figure out this data thing. And we shouldn't do it like in the 1990s, but we should do it like how it's done in the future. And that starts right now. And I think this is a super exciting like case study and perspective through the lens of Materialize that I think we can apply on like pretty much all technological systems, can take something away from this. So yeah, very excited about this one. Another one I'm personally also really excited about is having Carl Swear on the conference. He has in the past built a system called SQL Sync, which is a really, really interesting sync engine based on SQLite, which is like, as there are multiple technologies in the local first or sync engine space hovering around SQLite, me building also one of them. I think he has a particularly interesting approach by tackling this in a very low level way. He's worked in the past on different database engines, or he's like really like a distributed systems engineer, like through and through. And he's been working on some new systems as well called Graft, which is basically a sync engine for memory blocks that can, for example, empower a system like SQL Sync. So I think he's cooking some really, really interesting building blocks here that other systems could be built on top of, and you can build arbitrary collaborative applications on top of this. So if you build the next Figma, maybe you build it on top of that. So also really curious to hear more from Carl on this.
I think with that, you see some cross-fertilization between some of the concepts where So one thing that's really interesting about Graft is a lot of sync engines are syncing logical changes where it's more like physical replication. But of course, that's kind of the same technology underpinning serverless databases, things like Neon, for example, which has obviously recently been bought by Databricks, kind of because they were brought into this lake-based kind of concept, which is almost hybrid sort of analytics OLTP workloads for app building, which is exactly what we just discussed around Materialize. So actually some of these sort of like sync concepts are actually sort of fusing with some of the developments in cloud and analytics.
They also represent potentially very different approaches. My chat with Carl was basically, he's kind of like, the CRDT application level thing. No, do it at the, the lower physical level. And obviously there can be different technologies for different use cases. So it's not necessarily that they're in competition, but to that point of like, what is the right way to accomplish what we want to accomplish in our applications? We're all figuring it out together. And here are some different people who are on the cutting edge of trying each possible way of doing it. And let's kind of compare and contrast and learn from each other and get inspired and even compete a little bit. I think that's part of what makes it exciting.
Yeah, exactly. And I think about data, it's always the ultimate, like it depends. So you're building your system, you have like your trade-offs that you should leverage. And then around those trade-offs, pick the best data architecture, the best implementation, the best off-the-shelf sync engine, or roll your own. And I think someone like Carl has like over the years deeply studied those trade-offs and then has picked one that particularly spoke to him and started going all in on this to a level of like excellence and like focus on performance, etc., that I think is like hard to match. So anyone who's coming to the conference and you're trying to figure out like, how do we build maybe our own sync engine? Should we build our own sync engine? Carl is definitely a person to speak to. And I think that's also one of the main questions to figure out, like, hey, should we, for our product, should we build our own sync engine? The answer might be yes. Or should we use an off-the-shelf technology? Talking to other practitioners, is it a stupid idea to build your own sync engine? Or in which cases is it actually necessary? So I think that's one of the key questions that technical decision makers can find the answer for than in no other place than at this conference, I think. So I'm pretty excited about this. And another person I'm very thrilled to have is my friend Lee Byron, who is one of the co-creators of GraphQL. This is how I got to know him and spent a lot of time with him in my past life. But these days, he's working at OpenAI, and he's actually shipped some notable parts of ChatGPT, particularly the Canvas feature. And so the Canvas feature is like already exhibiting one of the things that you've mentioned, James, which is basically that the AI is collaborating with us humans. And so when you're using ChatGPT, you're collaborating on an artifact on this canvas. And so this is, to my understanding, actually driven by either a CRDT or OT-based system, like the details we'll get to learn at the conference talk. But this is where OpenAI had, with Lee's help, shipped their own implementation of this that powers this experience that many of us use on a day-to-day basis. And I'm really excited to hear his perspective, since he is obviously a connoisseur when it comes to good data management and tasteful data management. So I'm very curious what he has crafted there.
I think OpenAI as a product is also really interesting in showing that just this evolution of like how LLM models are being productized, where earlier generations you had a kind of fundamental model and an API, but the actual software architecture now in front of them with routing layers and complex parts of that software is just increasing and increasing. And that is a domain which is like, those are some of the most complex agentic systems. And so understanding the architecture of how to build those is then really interesting to kind of inform how to build other systems on similar architecture. And I think, as we're seeing, a lot of it is about being able to have different parts of the system, agents, services, users, kept in sync with the same data.
So another speaker I'm really looking forward to is you, Adam. Adam, you are giving a talk as well.
No one told me about this.
So what can we look forward to in your talk?
Yeah, I think the way I'm thinking of it is I do think it's still important to represent kind of those local first ideals. And again, people that come to this maybe from a more how do I build something today, pragmatic perspective, maybe it's a chance for them to also see those more aspirational things. So I think I'll probably focus on some of those local first fundamentals for this audience and perhaps somewhat updated to 2025. So that's probably the way I'll go. I mean, given that amazing lineup you just mentioned, and by the way, there's some we haven't even mentioned already, not to mention our CFP, which is, I think, closing in a few days. I don't know how we're going to fit it all in, but certainly I will be just one voice among many, but I hope to, again, at least be a chance to plant that seed for those that want to go a little deeper in some of the idealistic, aspirational, kind of long-term community pieces.
Yeah. And just to go through the list that we have of like speakers that are already announced, we also have Tanner Lindsley, who I think Electric actually has been collaborating with more closely lately.
So at Electric, we've been working with Tanner and the TanStack team on TanStack which is a new reactive client store built into TanStack for building applications on Sync. So TanStack is a popular framework for building web and mobile apps, and it evolved out of React Query originally, a kind of layer for doing some of the sort of shared boilerplate around query-based apps, talking to APIs where you have query caching and invalidation and then mutation primitives. And Tanner and my co-founder Kyle have both been kind of thinking about the developer experience of building on React Query and TanStack for a long while, and kind of envisaging a more local first approach with more comprehensive transactional optimistic mutation APIs as a kind of ideal way of building software. So I think like a lot of Tanner's perspective on this is as somebody who has great taste around software should be built and has built one of the best frameworks for doing that. And with TanStackDB, the collaboration has been a sort of way to go, can we build Sync into that framework in a way that still adheres to his sort of quality of developer experience? And I know that both Kyle and Tanner we're all very excited about what we've been able to create with TanStackDB. So I think he's going to be talking through some of the specifics there around what we've built, but also just his view generally around how software should be built ideally on a sync engine architecture.
Right. Yeah, I'm really excited for that. I mean, I had the honor to have Tanner on the podcast a little while ago where we talked about TanStackDB in more depth. And I think Tanner is really like, for me, representative of the target audience that I envision for the conference, like the pragmatists with taste and the aspiration for building high quality products, and doing so in a way, unlike me, how I'm building Overtone, which still hasn't shipped, but I'm trying to like get out the last bit of quality. And for me, it's about the journey as well. But I think TanStack as an ecosystem, that's for pragmatists. That's for people who want to ship not tomorrow, but today. And I'm really looking forward to like seeing how we're going to get the best of both worlds. That's like pragmatic software with a new approach of sync engine. So really excited for Tanner's contribution there as well. We also have a slightly different perspective, probably less from a practitioner's take here. We have Martin Casado from Andreessen Horowitz, who's in the past been like absolutely pivotal for many layers of the stack in like from software-defined networking. These days, he's a VC at Andreessen Horowitz, where he has a pretty good perspective on the larger software ecosystem on like infrastructure tools in particular. So he has been looking at sync engines for quite a while and that broader space. And so we're going to also hear his take on that ecosystem, which I'm really excited about as well.
Local First Conf, we always try to make sure we represent at least a little bit the business side, whether it's bringing up companies who have been successful at this, like Ditto, or someone who can speak about essentially the different business models and monetization, because that's definitely one of the biggest questions people have, is that SaaS and cloud and kind of data hoarding, you might call it, has been such an incredible business model in the last decade or so. And it's just really clear how you make money from that. But people have more maybe concerns or reservations about local first. I think in the end, actually, the business model looks pretty similar to SaaS realistically, but like having someone come in who can come at it from a hard-nosed investor perspective, again, in this case, they're less motivated by, I want a better developer experience or by any kind of idealism, but more just thinking, where is a good place to make money? Where are the next generation of successful software businesses going to be built?
Yeah. So there will be more talks, but I don't think they're yet announced. And there's still an open CFP as well, which maybe this is your last chance to try to speak at the conference by applying. There will be a selection committee, etc. We already got way more submissions than we have space for. But that being said, please take your chance to apply, as I think there is a quite an interesting range of different topics that should be represented at the conference. So there's more to talk about, but that's probably at a separate time. So maybe rounding out, there's still some tickets available to my knowledge. So for people interested coming to the conference, check out the conference website on syncconf.dev, where I think the early bird tickets are already sold out, but there's still the normal bird and late bird. And I think the birds are flying out pretty quickly. So you should get your chance to pick yours. And with that, maybe some last words from James and Adam on what you're looking forward most.
Yeah, I'll just add on to the call to action there to say, not just submit your talk if you want or buy a ticket if you want to come, but also if you know someone that, again, is kind of in that demographic of local first curious, but has never really taken the plunge, and you want to invite them, maybe this is the right opportunity for them to come into this world that we all love so much. And I'll also note that I think we're almost full on sponsors, but we maybe have one more space left. So if you want to do that, that's a possibility as well. You can just email us. Yeah. And as for your question of, what am I looking forward to most? That's really tough. I'll tell you what I'm not looking forward to is that, Johannes, typically you and I have done the blocking out of the schedule and figuring out the time slots and the breaks and all that stuff, and all of these great speakers, and cramming all of this into one day in a way that also leaves room for hallway track and, breathing space to think about what you've just learned. That is a challenge I am not looking forward to. But once we conquer that little milestone, I'll be very much looking forward to attending. And I think just like Local First Conf, being there, not only hearing the talks, but the ideas that are provoked from that, and hearing what people are building and how the talks kind of change their perspective or inspire them on that. I just have learned so much at our conferences these last 2 years. And I feel like this one that is in a new place with a slightly different type of person is also going to be a similar kind of, mind blow emoji, expand the perspective, new way to think about the space that, even though I've been thinking about it for over a decade, somehow I always feel like I learned something new at these conferences.
I think you kind of looking at a space like this, you get a sense of just the kind of timing of the ideas emerging. And certainly from my perspective, I just see people both talking about Sync more on social media. I see a lot of predictions that this is the key technology for the next years or more. And I suspect this is a one-day conference, right? It's a kind of maximum 300 people. And my hope and what I kind of think is that we'll look back on it in 10 years' time and see this as just one of the seminal conferences that actually the group of people who were there all then went on to do amazing things. And you kind of look back and it was a privilege to be there. So I think that's the kind of event that we're trying to create. And it kind of just feels like the timing is right there. It's such an exciting time in software development. And I think that this is just going to be one of the most sort of special occasions to be at that we'll look back on fondly in time.
I couldn't agree more.
Did we actually say when it is? November 12th, 2025 in San Francisco. And the website is syncconf.dev.
That's great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show to discuss this. And I'm looking forward to seeing the two of you at the conference in November in San Francisco. But I also hope to see many of our listeners at the conference.
Can't wait to reconnect with this community.
Awesome. All right.
See you then.
See you then. Thank you for listening to the Local First Event podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and haven't done so already, please subscribe and leave a review. Please also share this episode with your friends and colleagues. Spreading the word about the podcast is a great way to support it and to help me keep it going. A special thanks again to Jazz for supporting this podcast. I'll see you next time.